So I'm Meg Maclean, and I work in the Centre for Open Learning in the University of Edinburgh. Shaping equitable partnerships and comfortable TNE EAP practitioner identities. So I have the word comfortable in the title, and this is intended to describe conditions where values and practice align. So, for example, in teacher education, Edinburgh 97 explores teacher efficacy when values and practice align. And also Harris, 1992, places prominence on teachers' beliefs and their practice aligning. So when our personal values align with professional roles, this could be described as comfortable teacher identity or practitioner identity. So the journey I'll trace here is not always comfortable, but I'd argue that pursuing equitable TNE partnerships is a crucial goal. So this is what I hope to achieve. So firstly, I'll share my story, my journey from EAP practitioner to having a leadership role, and how my identities and, I guess, roles have shifted and been shaped by the roles and the wider context. I'll link the stages loosely to positioning theory, as I found that reflecting on identities is helpful in providing clarity and providing grounding as a grounding practice, but also to foster authenticity, and in providing clarity and in strategic planning. So I'll introduce then our specific TNE project developments, and I'll invite Hannah to participate here. And I'll conclude hopefully on a more positive note by pointing towards professional learning, but also alternative collaborative models. And I'll welcome audience insight. So I'll begin then with my background, and this is to contextualise, but it's also on a more personal note, because this forms the narrative behind the journey. So first of all, I'm a language learner. I was an international student for a period, a language teacher, before moving into teaching EAP, and there building a more theoretical knowledge base, notably academic literacies, where language is recognised as a social practice, and academic practices are shaped by disciplines, they're discipline specific, but also shaped by the socio-cultural context, which of course for our students can vary widely. So having an equitable platform is crucial if we're thinking about a social justice perspective. So as is evident in this context, EAP draws on multiple fields of inquiry, but I found that incorporating a lens of critical interculturality can be helpful in discussing communication, in critically looking at power imbalances in communication, in problematizing communication, so looking at trying to cultivate a social justice mindset for our context and for our students. So just to briefly introduce the context, so as I mentioned, we're based in the Centre for Open Learning in the University of Edinburgh. And this department is perhaps slightly unconventional because it's composed of three arguably disparate units. There's English language education, where we're based, Hannah and I, teaching EAP, academic language and literacies courses and components. There's Open Studies, who offer lifelong learning courses on a range of disciplines, topics from art to STEM. And there's Languages for All, who offer a range of language courses for matriculated as well as for non-matriculated students. So there's arguably a range of epistemologies represented, and perhaps a range of pedagogical approaches. Since 2024, I've held the role of Director of International, operating across the whole department, so across all 3 units, and working across the centre. So I'll talk about why this is relevant now. One of the projects that I'll talk about in a bit more detail is developing the department's international vision. So I approached this through a colleague input project, which was composed of focus groups. So these were held across all 3 units and professional services in the centre. And the focus groups reassuringly, happily revealed many commonalities, many shared ideas, shared principles, shared approaches. And a common thread here was colleagues' awareness of the need for equity and for inclusion, for student partnership, so whether this was through language or through pedagogy. So surfacing this shared disposition and perhaps definition of internationalisation in our centre strengthened this particular aspect of my professional identity. So I felt from this point more empowered, so that I had agency then to progress our centre's international strategy or international vision. So the next step for this project was to be informed by the student voice. And in this particular project, or particular part of the project, the student focus group's findings were shared in my contribution to the previous, or our previous value PIN, which was held at the University of Edinburgh. And in case you weren't there, the theme was the EAP student, identity and community and belonging. So you can see here that the student was placed at the centre, and the student's voice was afforded space and afforded attention within our department, within our institution. And a final point, just to illustrate COL, the Centre for Open Learning, as a decolonised space, is the Festival of Languages. So this was actually an outcome from the student focus groups in the previous project I mentioned. In the focus groups, the students expressed a desire to speak languages other than English, to share their languages and to share their ideas, their cultures in their own languages. So we successfully applied for Student Partnership Award funding, and we're developing this one-day festival, which will be a multilingual space with language taster sessions and language workshops. So from this, hopefully, you can see that in my role, I was able to collaboratively lead on the Centre's international vision, and I felt that in this multilingual, decolonised space, I felt empowered to leverage perhaps this intercultural expertise with the background of academic language and literacies to progress and develop different initiatives. So to link this then loosely, as I said, to identity framework, as is advocated by various people, for example, Ding in 2019, it's helpful to reflect on our journeys and on our destinations to map stages against a conceptual framework. So practitioner identity can shape effective practice. It can help us navigate pathways through tangled and sometimes contradictory priorities. Studies on the topic of identity in higher education, for example, Chahar in 2011, Mark et al. 24, point towards values and the need to understand our agency, and in a context which can be increasingly precarious, as we've heard quite a lot today, as well as having to respond to government policy, priorities, as well as increasing disruptive and volatile global events. So, a constructivist identity framework conceptualises identity then as dynamic and as constructed, as social and dialogical, as a process. So it's important to understand the self that's positioned or that's leading in the different contexts. And in the complex higher education environment, this can help to understand or perhaps to initiate our agency. And in positioning theory, as developed by Davies and Harry in 1999, and also defined by Harry and Van Langenhoff, 99, I'm not sure if those dates are correct, I'll need to check. Speakers can position the self, position others, and then also be positioned by others. So in the transnational project that I'm shortly to turn to, I position myself as collaborator, and of the international partners as equal, as bringing their own knowledge and their own expertise to enhance the project. So in exploring this idea of positionality, I hoped, in the context I'm about to turn to foster an equitable and inclusive community of practice. So here we go. So an opportunity was presented to develop a TNE partnership with a university in India. So we plan to develop a collaborative project. This was to develop an online pre-sessional pathway route into postgraduate study at the University of Edinburgh. We plan to develop, to lay the groundwork for a robust partnership, drawing on the strengths of both the institutions. We wanted to take our time. We wanted to rigorously and systematically work through the stages to make sure it was a sustainable partnership. So this partnership also aligned with institutional priorities, for example, of diversifying student cohorts. So we were contributing to institutional sustainability and also departmental visibility across the institution. So here are the components of the project. Features of the project included online workshops. So these were designed, I'll turn to more detail on those shortly, these were designed to work through the barriers and the enablers of the project. We plan to hold capacity building events to discuss our pedagogic values, to share our practices, to explore our approaches, to strengthen professional relationships, and to foster a sense of community. We planned online student sessions and surveys in order to be informed by the student voice, so that the pathway programme would be knowledgeable of the students who would be reaching. And this would be all through a kind of co-constructive approach. We would also have in-person focus groups in order to discuss and to understand the situation, the context in more depth, to understand the diverse needs of the specific students and progress the project this way. So all these components were designed to reject, as has been discussed earlier in earlier talks today, this colonial fly-in model where one institution then imposes its educational worldview on the other. So initial meetings were indeed very motivating. And through the first meetings, we actually surfaced many shared values, shared priorities, for example, of inclusion and access for the students. Here's some more detail of the first stage, the online workshops. So for each of these, you can see we had 6 workshops. And for each of these meetings, we had a detailed agenda with outcomes. And for each of them, we invited different role holders from both institutions to contribute, to share, so we could understand the context and the project really clearly. So you can see we were wanting to look at initially from working from the ground up, what would our vision and our principles be? How would the programme approval and progression look like? And then finance and cost sharing. This was initially envisaged to be early. We wanted to have this quite surfaced early on in the process because we wondered if it might be a hurdle. In the end, it actually moved further down. I can't remember why. Was it because we thought it was initially important to look at the teaching first?
I think it was partly because the partner were really keen to understand a lot to do with our processes around progression, around programme validation, and around quality assurance. I think there might also have been some availability issues with some of our finance colleagues, but it meant that it got pushed sort of later in the stages of the things that we did. Yeah.
So this is really kind of the main sticking point of how the discussions happened. As the discussions progressed, the barriers seemed to dominate the discussions, and elements of the original plan seemed to fall away. When our finance business partner joined the discussions, the realities of the high UK employment costs, the economic and the operational limitations became clear as well, and the tensions between the financial drivers of the project and the values-led collaboration intensified. So the course co-delivery costs would be prohibitively high. Also, our CPD, our practice sharing session. Edinburgh University had to retain the quality assurance in order for our admissions to accept this pathway programme into postgraduate study at the University of Edinburgh. So if we were to retain equitable cost sharing, Edinburgh would only have this gatekeeping function, essentially. So in assessment, in moderation, standardisation, board of examiners. And there would have to be a high number of students to be recruited in order for the programme to be financially viable. So this applied pressure to our partner. They were compelled to recruit a high number of students in a economies of scale model. So the discussion was then moving from collaboration, a collaborative model, to a focus on cost, with one partner in a kind of authority position, displaying a kind of power imbalance. So we were moving then away from course co-creation. It felt like we were effectively repackaging a course, a kind of product, selling a product with inequitable sharing. And this is due to high UK employment costs, rendering the course as we'd initially envisaged inviable. So I felt values, identities were shifting. So away from collaboration, from co-creation, from understanding each other, to pushed by marketisation. How would the project components fit then? How would they feel comfortable, to return to that word, in terms of the Director of International position, having moved from collaborator, from looking at a decolonised, multilingual environment, to this kind of less equitable or co-creative model? How about our institutional values? So we prioritise access in the Centre for Open Learning, but with this model, which would perhaps be expensive, would we then be targeting just the high layers of a social hierarchy? So at this point, I'm going to invite Hannah to participate. So we plan to reflect on a few of the ideas within this. I think we're going to begin with what we both, so reflect on what we both initially wanted to achieve in this project.
So I think I've also really enjoyed listening to what you've been saying, Meg, and how, and sort of knowing where this was going as well. And I do think that we ended up in a place where we were both a bit outside of our comfort zone, but I think it's fair to say that that was more so maybe for you than for me, because I think that while I, at the beginning, and still really, really did and still do support the values-led approach and the collaborative approach that you've taken. I think I was maybe less surprised than you that we got stuck on the finance. And so for me, what I wanted to get out of this project was the same as what Meg wanted to get out of it, but also different. So from the beginning, when I first heard that we received this request from a big private university in India to provide an online pre-sessional for them, I'll just admit, I saw pound signs. And I don't mean that in a really crude and horrible way. I mean that in the context of seeing an opportunity to diversify what we do in our centre and protect the community of EAP practitioners that I work with there. And I didn't see the two things in tension. I didn't see the financial driver and the values driver as in tension. But I definitely was less surprised when we got stuck on it. It was still also a journey for me as well, though. But I think to answer that question, what did I want to get out of it? It was that. I would also add that it was really interesting listening to you talk today, because one of the things that I found at the very beginning of this project was I didn't know what to do. And I had to go and speak to my informal network and say, can you tell me how you do this? And some people, quite a few people, were happy to talk to me, but they wanted it completely off the record, because these are commercial partnerships. I was able to have Teams conversations with people who, some of whom are here, some of whom are not, that I can't name, because they were really clear. And I think that's one of the problems with getting started with TNE as well, is you don't have the same critical friendship groups that you have in other areas of EAP provision. There's not a kind of public manual, despite all the support that is there from institutions like British Council and UK government, as we heard earlier. There's not that real kind of this is how you do it piece.
So it's really interesting to hear that we were at very kind of different starting positions.
Different and the same.
What I was hoping was really to be able to learn. I'm just going to switch to the next slide, just to demonstrate this imbalance or perhaps tension.
This isn't us, though, by the way, just to be clear.
What I was hoping for was to understand the Indian context. So coming from a language background or a passion for languages, the Indian context is so rich. So I was hoping that we could understand attitudes towards language in that context, and then attitudes towards English in that context. So thinking about as a colonial language or as a language of mobility, and how English then relates to the other languages in that context, and especially in the higher education context when we're talking about academia and progression to a UK postgraduate route. And I was hoping that we'd get to the stage of the focus groups, of being able to share something, so I could learn, so that our course, our pathway programme would be specific according to the needs of that particular students in that particular context. And I'm not sure if we're
doing that,
if we're going to get there.
Well, I don't think we've got there yet, for sure, because we've got stuck on elements of the financial sort of cost-sharing agreement. And the big issue that we discovered was that despite what the prospective partner had said in the early stages, it became apparent through the costing work that we did that they don't actually have evidence of demand of the number of students that would make it work. And this was just something that none of us had really anticipated. But in terms of that learning piece, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in the sort of informal conversations that I've had in my institution with more senior colleagues in the institution, the way that government strategy is being responded to is very much around not doing TNE just.
as a sort of education product, but wrapping it into a more multifaceted partnership that would include research and scholarship. So I think actually the way that you were approaching this in terms of like not just what we're going to do, but what are we going to learn from this, is actually likely to be direction of travel as well.
So that is one of the valid points, I think, is what professional learning is there. And I think one thing we had discussed was that we wouldn't do it the same way again, so we would certainly involve the finance business partner earlier in discussions.
And their finance people as well. So I think, to be fair, they were just as naive as we were in terms of not actually, I think both partners, just going to say it, I don't think either one of us really knew what we were doing. And we got to this in certain ways, because we suddenly got to this point where we were like, well, these are our costs, so we've calculated you'd need this many students. And they went, oh. And it was really, we're opening the bonnet on this, but it really was a journey, I think, for the partner as well as for us.
So if we're thinking about what we've learned from it, then perhaps a different approach or a slightly switched around order?
Well, I think it's really difficult though, because the sort of the obvious learning from it is we should have sorted the finance first. But then it would have been the opposite of what we wanted, because then it would just have been financially driven, whereas we want it to be values led. So I think it's maybe more in tandem if we were to do it again. We're still, this isn't dropped, it's just slightly stuck, to be fair.
So looking at the next possible ways forward. And if we think if we were to link that to identities, I think naivety, that's a good word. And there's maybe shame that comes with that, so perhaps that I was hoping for something aspirational that's perhaps not realistic. And there is then funding still, there's this gap in UK funding anyway. So, where to now? I'm putting this question to you first, as a senior member of staff.
So in terms of that particular project, we do hope to continue those conversations and reach a point where we have an agreed model that we can take forward into a legal agreement. In terms of where to next, as regards sort of TNE as an area of innovation and future developments, as I've just said, I think I would approach it slightly differently in terms of thinking about the financial drivers, but also just being aware that this is not something that you're necessarily going to make a lot of money from, not if you're going to put all the costs in. So if you don't have those values-driven reasons for getting into it, you might also question whether it's worth it. That would be my take. But as we've hopefully shown you, we are newbies to this as well.
From the outset, we weren't planning, and we'd said to the partner as well, it's not profit-driven.
Yeah.
It just needs to be financially viable.
It just needs it to be neutral.
So we don't lose money on the project. I think there's also scope perhaps for collaboration within college, so cross-schools collaboration. So perhaps we look at this initially from a Edinburgh college perspective, working internally, and then looking at how we sit then, how an EAP sits within a TNE collaboration.
Well, I'm sort of, based on what we heard today, I'm also wondering, was pre-sessional ever the right product? Or was there maybe something else we should have been doing?
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Pre-sessional is something which we're accustomed to.
And we had it ready to sell. Let's just be practical as well.
We're hoping for it to be a little bit more specific for that institution, however. But if it was cross college, so within University of Edinburgh, then perhaps the risks would be balanced more and costs would be spread a little bit more. And then we'd be working in collaboration with content lecturers. So perhaps there are still alternative models, ways to proceed.
Definitely.
I don't know if I had anything else that I wanted to pick your brains about, but I think there's definitely been lots of learning. lots of discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to approach these projects through a practitioner identity lens, as Meg is doing. And I, have spoken before and often think about leadership identity. And so I think it is quite, if you're an EAP practitioner thinking about doing something like this, I think it will confront and challenge you in terms of the identities that are going to come into play. I think that's kind of the takeaway.
Also thinking about the place of EAP within this, so which position does it have? Is it this external, peripheral, or are we more embedded within the project? I think that's worth exploring as well.
Definitely.
Okay, so just to come to a close then, I guess comfortable can then equate slightly with ethical. So if we're thinking about trying to pursue an ethical TNE collaboration, there's a need to balance the obligation to have an equitable partnership, a mutually beneficial partnership, and for that to kind of outweigh the challenge. So perhaps the need is greater than the challenge, that yes, it was never going to be easy, it was never going to be straightforward. I mean, the costs are definitely really challenging because of global issues that we don't have any control over, and colonial history that's obviously in the past, and we don't have any control over that either. But we need to try and pursue this. I think we've kind of covered this, but thinking about final outcomes of the project, perhaps it's distant in the way that we conceptualise it from how we did initially. Perhaps not such a great extent for Hannah, but it has advanced professional learning, so understanding financial barriers, and then thinking about next steps, perhaps in collaboration with our EAP partners, perhaps in collaboration with our University of Edinburgh school partners, perhaps working less in a silo and more collaboratively, but retaining this aspect of collaboration and aspiration for it to be mutually beneficial, for there to be learning.
Yeah, I would just add to that I feel it feels a bit strange to be presenting on something that didn't go so well, but I think we so often hear presentations about how everything's fixed, and so I actually think it's quite interesting to hear about the sort of nuts and bolts sometimes of how things don't work out, or don't work out in quite the way that you hoped they would, even though I still think we'll do something here, but it definitely didn't go quite how we thought it would.
Yeah, so in that it's perhaps a little bit exposing that it isn't a finished, final, polished, successful product or course, however you want to package that. It's been something which has been very educational, and
sure.
we still retain hope that we'll manage to achieve something. And of course there perhaps is need in the financial climate to find some way to generate more income for our department. So thank you. I'm going to stop there. For irony.